Hello and welcome to another episode of this long-term reading project in which we discuss Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain step by step. If you're joining for the first time, you can find the introductory video and all previous videos here in this playlist. So in this episode, we are looking at the fourth and fifth section of chapter 6 of the novel. That is the sections with the headings Choler and Worse and An Attack and a Repulse. I'm sorry the English version of this video took so long for me to produce, but I had started to record it a month ago when I produced the Italian and the German version, but the English version was the last one I recorded, and I had some technical difficulties. I recorded it twice, and both times I wasn't able to save the file, and then I went on vacation, and then procrastination kicked in. But here we are now, moving on also with the English version. Okay, after giving a first brief summary of what happens in these two sections, I will then analyze them as usual, one after the other. And also, as usual, I will start by giving you an overview of the structure of my video. So on the first section, I have 7 points and 3 points on the second section that we discussed today. So 1.1 is we see another variation on the theme of time. 1.2 is how credible is the narrator? 1.3 is Hans, is he a naive fatalist or a teleologist in disguise? Number 1.4, Hans and Joachim, relationship disaster. 1.5, a bitter insight. 1.6, eroticism and comedy. 1.7, miscellaneous, a few smaller points. And then on the second section, an attack and a repulse. My first point is a hall of mirrors. Second point, so what? And the third point, some additional small excursion tips for your journey up the Magic Mountain in this specific section. Okay, let's start with an overview of what happens here. In the section Choler, there is a showdown between Joachim and Hofrat Behrens. Joachim feels that he has been made a fool of, and he decides to leave on his own authority in order to finally begin his service as a soldier in the 76th Regiment of the Prussian Army. And this disregard for Behrens' medical authority, this triggers an outburst of rage in Behrens, which also extends in the beginning to Hans. But as Hans then decides to stay at the Berghof, the situation calms down again, at least for Hans. But Joachim is actually going to leave the Berghof. In this section, an attack and a repulse, Hans is visited by his relative James Teenapple, a young cousin of Hans' deceased mother. So James is somewhere between the generations. He is only slightly older than Hans, but much younger than Hans, the generation of Hans' parents. And so James has probably been instructed by his worried relatives to see to it that Hans is not rotting away up there, but rather to persuade him to return to the middle class life at Hamburg. But from the Teenapple family's point of view, this mission backfires badly. James Teenapple himself, he almost succumbs to the magic of the mountain, to the magic of the Berghof, and he only manages to escape it by making a really hasty departure. So in future, Hans has he no longer has to fear any harassment or intervention from his relatives. They will leave him alone up there. So now let's look at the sections one after the other in more detail. So my first observation, my first point on the first section is we have a new or a variation on the theme of time. The topic of time has been considered from many perspectives in the novel already. So we've been talking about the relativity of time, the unpredictability of time, the circularity of time, and at the beginning of the section, Choler now brings time into play as the immeasurable, the eternal, that is ultimately a state of timelessness. And so what is explained here is that measuring individual time, like celebrating anniversaries. That's something for the beginners. The tactful and educated long-term patient ignores such trivial things like anniversary, and he or she lives, so to speak, in a state of complete detachment from time. I quote from the text: to measure one's own private time, that was held to be an occupation only fit for new arrivals and short-termers. The settled citizens preferred the unmeasured, the eternal, the day that was forever the same. End of quote. And this reinforces the impression that the Berghof is a genuine parallel world of its own, exempt from the normal world and the normal rules and even the most elementary rules and laws of physics, such as the passage of time, or the cyclical passage, or the annual cycle of time. Observation number two, the narrator again dismantles his own credibility. At the beginning of the chapter, we're also given further indication by the author that the narrator is not 100% reliable. Within a few sentences, the narrator's assertions are belied by what is described shortly afterwards. The point, a good example is, the point is still that the old-timers do not celebrate anniversaries of their length of stay, and reminding someone of such an anniversary, I quote, that would have been considered brutal, bad taste. It simply never happened. And further on, even Frau Stör was far too tactful and well-disciplined to let it slip out. Or a more literal translation would be, she would never have committed such an offense. But then, only a few lines later, it is described that on Hans Castrup's anniversary, this very Frau Stör, Mrs. Stör, tried to remind him of the special nature of his day by nodding to him meaningfully at the table. Again, I prefer a more literal translation, like winking to him in a meaningful way. But anyway, so we see that despite what had been stated by the narrator earlier, that it simply never happened, she would never have committed such an offense. No, it's not the case. She is not tactful enough, but she is doing what is considered brutal and bad taste, and what was said to never happen here. Okay, so we see that the narrator seems to contradict himself in this section. Third observation, or it's more a question: is Hans a naive fatalist or a disguised teleologist? So this section that immediately follows about the capricious weather, the much too early onset of autumnal or even wintry weather, that gives us an insight into the resignation to fate with which Hans has settled into his situation. For him, everything is fine the way it is. This is a very comfortable form of fatalism in which you can make yourself very comfortable and cozy, because it means that you have no responsibility to do anything, to change anything. It was meant to be. So the decisive sentence is: the world, as normally arranged, is conducive to man's needs and his pleasure in life. And then Hans continues that our needs are in harmony with the larger, the fundamental facts of nature. Now, when summer or winter comes along down below, the past summer or winter is far enough in the past to make one glad to see it again. And therein lies the joy we have in life. So he later qualifies this a little, and he says he's not a supporter of teleology, not to be confused with theology. Teleology is a philosophical school of thought that assumes that all processes and developments in our reality are heading towards a certain goal. All this is meaningful. It's running towards a predefined end. And although Hans superficially denies being a supporter of teleology, the thoughts he describes are in fact a form of teleology, albeit a mild one. So that's the usual game of the narrator with its contradictions. And so, in Hans' opinion, the local deviation from this teleological principle of the weather at the Berghof, where the seasons are mixed up a little bit, in his opinion, this is the cause of the unease that many patients, including Joachim, feel up here. And it is quite logical that Thomas Mann ridicules this a little bit, and he makes a side blow to teleology here, because we had already talked about the fact that Thomas Mann was strongly influenced by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and his philosophy. And I think it was video number 11 in which I described the main features and the main core ideas of Schopenhauer's work, The World as Will and Representation, at the end of the video. And I think it became clear that for Schopenhauer, the will as the main principle that drives the world, this, in his opinion, is completely something completely blind and aimless. So there's no room for teleology in Schopenhauer's system. If one, without one exemption, if one disregards this, the will's aim or ambition of wanting to recognize itself. But apart from that, the will is completely blind and aimless. Incidentally, it is interesting from a historical perspective that teleological ways of thinking had and still have a long tradition in philosophy and natural science before and after The Magic Mountain was written. As early as in the 1870s, some schools of thought in physics, especially in astronomy and cosmology, they pointed out that certain properties of the universe must be exactly as they are, down to the nth decimal place of some natural constants, in order for any matter or even any atoms or elementary particles to exist at all. If there were just very minor changes at the 10th decimal of some nature constants, nothing would exist. So the after the Big Bang, the whole universe would have been collapsed in a big blow up of energy. So from this perspective, the conditions prevailing on planet Earth also appear to be exactly such that the emergence and evolution of life is possible at all, or rather, some other strong proponents have claimed that it is almost inevitable. So, and considerations of this kind were made under the label teleology in several natural sciences, especially by natural scientists who were also familiar with either philosophical or theological traditions. And this tradition continued for almost a century. And in the 1970s, these developments were then subsumed under the new term, the newly coined term, anthropic principle, from the direction of theoretical physics. But in the nutshell, the idea was very similar. And one of the key statements from the proponents of this anthropic principle goes like this: like, what the current universe is only observable because it has precisely those properties that enable the emergence of intelligent observers. And this goes right down to the so-called fine-tuning of the constants of nature, or the fine-tuned universe. And this goes, yeah, um, this continues. So also today, modern proponents of the so-called intelligent design hypothesis also borrow from this line of thought. For those of you who are not familiar with the term intelligent design theory, it's a specific branch of the creationist belief that is proposing that so the whole universe is not that just the result of some random processes, but there are clear indications that there is some superior intelligence behind it, so that there is intelligent design inherent to the nature and matter and the law of physics. This is, I think, a fascinating and thoroughly controversial field at the interface between natural sciences, philosophy, and religion, which I can only just briefly mention here. I will not go into the details of discussing it, but for those who are interested in this topic in more detail, I think a good starting point would be the Wikipedia entries on anthropic principle and on fine-tuned universe. So these are the keywords where you will find Wikipedia entries that I really recommend as an introduction to these ideas, or to the history of these ideas. So that was a bit of a digression, but perhaps some of you will find it interesting to see the context of the history of some of the ideas that are touched on here very lightly in The Magic Mountain. The dispute between Hans and Joachim that follows at this point is also interesting in terms of the relationship between the two, and Hans' relationship skills in general. So that's my fourth point. Hans and Joachim, this seems to be a relationship disaster. Um, let me let me point out why I think this is the case. I think there's clear indication that Hans can analyze and name Joachim's displeasure, but with three very important limitations. First, he can only do it in a very superficial way. For Hans, the bad weather is the main cause of Joachim's moodiness, which completely misses Joachim's actual situation. Joachim is suffering because he feels like his life is slipping through his fingers. He is being held back from finally living his dream and joining the military. And Hans lacks any empathy, I think. For Hans, it is sufficient to name and to understand and to transfigure the superficial problem. And for him, that is more or less the end of it for him. To put it more philosophically, for him, the conceptual grasp of the world is the same as taking possession of the world and reassuring himself of his own role in the world. And that's the end of any problem. For him, having understood and named the thing or the problem, having pigeonholed it, that's the end of the problem. He cannot comprehend that for Joachim, this man of action, the matter at that point, the matter is not settled at all, but the real problem only begins at this point. And thirdly, he is unable to talk about emotions. He cannot even allow a language of closeness, of emotionality. This already began in the first chapter. The cousins don't really know how to address each other. They avoid first names. And Hans never addresses Joachim about his obvious lover's grief for Marussia. And at the end, it is Joachim who finally break through and what an embarrassment. He actually addresses Hans by his first name when saying goodbye, and for the first time he finds some sort of personal emotionality. Hans, he says fervently, come down soon. And so this is the most personal and emotional sentence uttered between the two cousins who have lived next door to each other 24/7 for over a year, living through and suffering through all their meals, their resting cures, and their medical examinations together. And I think that tells a lot about their relationship and about their bonding skills. Um, I'm not sure whether this is a subtle or not so subtle criticism by Thomas Mann of this pre-war generation, his own generation, a generation for whom composure and etiquette are much more important than being genuinely human. That's just the case. So that's just a guess. We have seen some incident where Hans had been able to show some emotion. That was his evening talk with Claudia, but that then he had to switch to French in order to be able to talk about emotions. So in his native language, he has not been able. So he had to like a role he's putting on stage, like talking through a mask. That in that case, he was able to talk about emotions, but not in his natural way. Point number 5: a bitter realization. Hans, come down soon. That was Joachim's parting sentence, but as readers, we also suspect from this chapter at the latest that Hans will not be coming down. This is presented to us as an insight also gained by Hans himself, that he will never find his way back to the lowlands on his own. Just like his namesake Hans in the German fairy tale Hans and Gretel, from whom the birds have pecked away all the breadcrumbs they had used to lead their way, and who now shudders and realizes that he is lost or they are lost. Also, now Hans shudders and realizes that he is unable to find his way back home. Or even worse, he is even unable to try. He is unable to try, he is unable to leave because he had to wait for Claudia Chauchat. But humans have an indestructible tendency to rationally explain and justify their own behavior. We are really great, doing great in that. And that's also what Hans is doing here. He transfigures his self-imposed duty to wait into the ethical and pseudo-religious um, sphere. He again uses the term taking stock from his childhood to describe his daydreams, the hard and harassing task it was his duty to perform here in his chair and up there in his blue blossoming retreat. Leaving would have been desertion for him. It would be fleeing from responsibility. And this is an interesting reversal of perspective. Most external observers and readers would rather assume that Hans was evading the responsibility of bourgeois life, of the good citizen, by prolonging his stay at the Berghof, and that this is a sort of desertion. But he is turning it the other way around. So this is the ethical and moral perspective. But Hans then goes so far as to become almost religious. To leave would be a betrayal of homo dei, and this is another very interesting term in terms of religious history that the narrator uses here. Homo Dei. Literally translated from Latin, the term simply means man of God. However, at least in Christian theology, this is a term with a whole range of meanings and connotations that also have changed over history. And all of these meanings, they all more or less make sense and resonate here. And so I would like to touch, I think this is really not by not a random thing that Thomas Mann uses this term here, but he must have placed it here on purpose because he was aware of these complex connotations. And so I would like to touch a few of them here. Origin and more or less in chronological order. Originally, the term Homo Dei was used in the Latin version of the biblical text, the Vulgata text, to characterize particularly devout and observant godly people and spiritual leaders. For example, in the Old Testament, this term was used in relation to Moses and in relation to the prophet Samuel, the one who anointed the young shepherd boy David as the future king of Israel. And later, the concept became a bit more philosophically charged and slightly changed. For example, the church father St. Augustine used the term to describe the likeness of man to God. And so this also goes back to some biblical texts, for example, to the book of Genesis, where it is said, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And so this is how St. Augustine is using the term, the similarity of man to God. And interestingly, this is a central core idea for the image of man in all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, but what we see here is Homo Dei is no longer just a label for a small group of individual, particularly pious people, but it's a statement about a special quality of all people, of all human beings, due to their because of their nature as creatures of God, created in His image. And in the same tradition, but a bit later in the Middle Ages, the theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas used the term Homo Dei again, but he used it for man as being a being that is endowed with reason by God. And in this aspect, in the reason, there is something divine. So there's this is therefore also a somewhat more intellectual narrowing down of the term. And later in the Reformation theology, the Puritan theology and the Catholic Jansenist movement, which was particularly widespread in France in the 17th and 18th century, the term Homo Dei was used differently again. It was used for man's dependence on God and submission to God's will. So Homo Dei is not any human being, but Homo Dei is the person who recognizes and accepts this dependence and submission. And at this stage, then now the theology of the Western Church now approaches again and touches with the tradition of the term, how it was cultivated since antiquity in the so-called Orthodox churches or Eastern churches, like the Byzantine churches. So there too, Homo Dei, or in the ancient Greek, anthropos tou theou, is a kind of a goal to be achieved, to be striven for the pious. So through asceticism, prayer, and a pious life, ultimately to become what God already is by nature, so divine. And so, theologically speaking, this is about man's participation in divine life without using his or her human nature. So this kind of spiritualization or deification of humans is the central goal of spiritual life in the theology of the Eastern Orthodox churches. So why all this digression into the history of theology? Firstly, quite banal and egoistic because I'm interested in these topics, and admittedly, these topics always trigger something in me, so that I become slightly chatty on that topic. Secondly, I do this on purpose to create an awareness of how we are only scratching the surface of this text, even with a 1 hour video covering only 30 pages, because um, beneath some of the key terms that the narrator drops in passing with a mischievous, innocent smile, beneath these terms, such as teleology or homo dei, there are huge gold mines of European history of ideas and philosophical topics, or in a more modern language, these are fascinating and deep rabbit holes that can be explored and where a good deal of insight can be gained. But I have to admit, you can also get lost down there, of course. That's a risk. So those were the personal and didactic reasons why I made this long digression in the history of theology of this term homo dei. But there's also a content-related literary reason, of course. I think these explanations have made us realize that the narrator, by using this term homo dei, he is using an extremely ambiguous or multifaceted term here, one that carries in itself completely opposite meanings, but which all make sense in a certain way in relation to Hans. So we can see Hans as the godlike man who uses his God-given intellect, of course, supported by Settembrini and after, to make sense of the world and to become free in the intellectual sense. Or the man who sees himself as dependent on a god, a deity, or another higher power and submits to it. Probably it's not the Christian God, but Claudia Shosha. So we have already identified a huge contradictory field of tension between freedom, sovereignty on the one hand, and submission, dependence on the other hand, in this innocent looking little term, homo dei. So both meanings are inherent in this term, depending on which school of thought you subscribe to. I personally believe that Hans sees himself outwardly in the position of the free homo dei, free from the constraints of the bourgeois life here on the Berghof, free to use his intellect and free to indulge in uh, his inclinations toward leisure and intellectual dilettantism, and thus to work on perfecting his life and his character. But de facto, inwardly, however, he is not free, but he has subjected himself to a deity. However, this deity to whom Hans has submitted is not a deity in the theological or even Christian sense. His deity is life and love, represented by Claudia Chauchat. But here too, the ambiguity inherent in the concept of homo dei applies. You can see this as a voluntary act on Hans' part to link his fate with Claudia's fate, but you can also interpret it as a dependency imposed on him, as something that is so firmly anchored and rooted in his nature that he simply is forced to do it by his own personality. So, and this is, I think, also how it is described in the text, because he had to wait for Claudia Shusha. So there's a clear tension and ambiguity in this concept of homo dei when we apply it to Hans. And there's also an ambiguity in the deity to whom he submits, the old dichotomy between life and death. On the one hand, Hans' infatuation with Claudia was presented to us several times as his turning towards life. But living is dying. I recall the quote from Hofrat Behrens and Hans and his scientific speculations of Hans about life, which we talked about in the 11th video. And that is why this infatuation with life keeps our Homo Dei Hans Castorp very specifically in a place that is rather a godless or a god-forsaken place, a place that is all about dying and death and carnal lust. And that leads me to my sixth chapter, eroticism and comedy, because this, yeah, the role of eroticism and the Berkhoff, this is exactly the point that seems to make life difficult for Hofrat Behrens. He is fed up with it, as he puts it. So he said that tuberculosis seems to go hand in hand with a particular increase in libido, and at least that's the explanation that Hofrat Behrens comes up with. I think it's more in the nature of things when you lock young people up in a sanatorium with good food and endless amounts of free time. So then biology and hormones simply do their job, especially when there's also a kind of panic involved because you don't know how much longer you can live and enjoy life. So, incidentally, I find Behrens' lament about his patient's amorous adventures highly comical beneath the surface. On the one hand, the way Behrens repeatedly interrupts his monologue of moral indignation just to dictate, by using just single words most of the time, to dictate the findings of his examination, vesicular dullness here, slight harshness here. So this to me is sort of funny. And then the use not only of medical terms for sexual desire, such as libido, but also the term concupiscence. And this is an explicitly theological term chosen by the ancient so-called church fathers, which connotes the sinfulness of the human sex drive. In other words, here again we have another example of Behrens' typically snotty combination of medical jargon, officers' mess jargon, and then again highly intellectual and educational and even theological chunks of language. Or the description of the erotic scandal that is the cause of Behrens' indignation and lamentation. This patient named Polypraxios is caught red-handed during a love adventure. And if you translate the name Polypraxios from ancient Greek, it means the busy one, or more literal, the one who does a lot. So it's a tongue-in-cheek hidden hint from the narrator that we're probably dealing with a repeat offender and a philanderer here. Or these casually interwoven reference that the public prosecutor Paravant, in order to distract himself from his libido, is concerned with squaring the circle. A little reminder of mathematical lessons. Squaring the cycle is mathematically impossible. It has been suspected since ancient times to be impossible, and it was formally proven mathematically by Ferdinand von Lindemann in 1882 at the latest. So it's therefore somewhat comical when a mathematical layman tries to rewrite the history of mathematics in order to get his testosterone under control. Incidentally, there's a nice anecdote about Lindemann. Heisenberg, this famous physician who later won the Nobel Prize for Physics, he originally wanted to study mathematics with Professor Lindemann, the one who proved that it's impossible to square the circle. And when Heisenberg introduced himself to Lindemann, as was customary at the time, Lindemann harshly rejected the young Heisenberg because Heisenberg mentioned in this conversation that he was particularly interested in the use of mathematical methods in physics. And Lindemann is said to have harshly ended the conversation with a comment, then you are already spoiled for mathematics anyway. So probably Lindemann did not just prove the impossibility of squaring the circle, but he also made a great contribution to physics by pushing Heisenberg away from math. So, but that was another digression. Let's move on to my seventh point on this first section. A few miscellaneous points. The narrator drops a whole series of further allusions that lend themselves to further analysis, but which I will not include here due to time constraints. I will only mention these as suggestions, so to speak, for those of you who are willing to further pursue them by yourself if you're so inclined. Now, the first one, on the one hand, the narrator again plays with a lot of biblical allusions and biblical style to make it clear that to us that some theological and philosophical meanings also resonate from him here. We have seen this with the term homo dei, with the concept of concupiscence, but even if the duration of Joachim's stay of a year and a half is given as 7 times 70. This is an allusion to a biblical formulation and a well-known expression at that time. In terms of content, there's no reference at all to the subject of the biblical passage in question. I think the narrator is only concerned with the linguistic style at this point, with the atmosphere of a particularly meaningful and symbol-laden language. Second point, from the perspective of symbolism, we could also say something about why the coachman who drives Joachim into the valley is repeatedly referred to as the lame man or the limping one. So several possible links here. The Christian devil, the Norse god Loki, the ancient god Vulcan, and the Greek tragic hero Oedipus. So they all were said to have been limping. So there seems to be some connection between of limping with prophecy and moral ambivalence. But also like to remind you that the name Claudia or Claudia actually means the limping one. So also another level of possible links and connections. In order to trace the connections between the fictional world and the novel and the real historical world of Thomas Mann, it might also be worth taking a look at the history of the 76th Infantry Regiment, to which Joachim joins as after he's leaving the Berghof. So this is an infantry regiment that actually existed and that was mainly constituted by young men from Lübeck and Hamburg. So it makes sense with this biographical connection to Thomas Mann and to Hans Castorp as a citizen of Hamburg. Fourth point, elements of intertextuality could also be examined by means of the passage where the journey across the wide abysmal lake is described. And so the lake that is mentioned here is Lake Constance. And this is taken in the text as an opportunity to allude to the German poem or ballad from 18 something written by Gustav Schwab. The ballad with the title Der Reiter und der Bodensee, so the horseman and Lake Constance. So, and also death plays an important role in this ballad, also worth to take a look at this in detail, or to analyze in more detail what exactly it is in the conversation with Joachim that makes Hofrat Behrens so completely upset and triggers his fit of temper. I think these are all nice potential rabbit holes to look into, but not in today's video. It's time to take a look at the next section, an attack and a repulse. So for this section, my first point would be under the caption, a hall of mirrors. So the first thing that strikes me about this section is that it is almost a perfect mirror image of Hans' arrival scene in the first chapter. Only this time, Hans takes on the role of the experienced resident that Joachim used to play, and James Tinapel is the newcomer who takes on Hans' former role. So there are so many similarities or mirror images, and this is I can't list them all. I'll just indicate the most important ones or most obvious one that jumped right into my face when reading the text. So the visitor must be asked to get out of the coach because he has already arrived at the final destination station without realizing it. The visitor often uses the expression certainly, of course, the same way Hans did when he arrived. By the way, another linguistic digression, there is something that does not show in the English translation because here the author in the German original is playing with a specific variant in the pronunciation of the German word for certainly, selbstverständlich, to explain it very shortly. In many German words, when the letter S is followed by a T, the S is actually pronounced like sh. I think the only English word is the word with this specific sound combination, sh followed by a T, is a word like the word shtick, a word from Yiddish that has made it into English. So if you see an S followed by a T, it's often this st with shtick sound. But the Hamburg dialect, however, pronounces the ST combination, both letters separately, like an English speaker would do. So it's not selbstverständlich, but selbstverständlich. And this is a very characteristic thing of the people in Hamburg. It's not a dialect, because apart from this very specific sound combination, the local language is 99% standard German or High German. Um, but here in chapter 1, it was mentioned that Hans still spoke that way, this Hanseatic Hamburg way, whereas Joachim didn't. And now it is James who speaks in that particular way, like the people in Hamburg do, but Hans does not do that anymore. He has already adapted to the local way of talking. So the visitor is always feeling cold, but the locals don't. And the visitor often speaks in the no, the local speaks in the first person plural. We do not feel cold here. So he's explicitly representing himself as a part of a community. And in both cases, we see that the visitor has very different ideas about time and speed, and he's immediately informed that time is measured differently at the Berghof. And at the beginning of this chapter, the very same flowers are mentioned here that were also mentioned in the beginning of the novel, when Hans first explores the surroundings of the Berghof for the very first time. And during the drive from the railway station to the Berghof, the local guide points out the Schatzalp sanatorium, which is located higher up, and he reports that in winter, dead bodies are transported down here on bobsleighs. And the newcomer's room was fumigated with H2CO. Today, by the way, this chemical is called formaldehyde. And then they have dinner together, and the dwarf lady serves quickly, and there's a lot of drinking, alcoholic beverages. And the guest takes a big bite, but the long-term occupant is busy talking and telling stories. And immediately after dinner, shortly before retiring to his bedroom, the guest has a first encounter with Dr. Krukowski in an exhausted and slightly drunken state, during which he's unable to say much of anything witty. So the visitor is afraid of not having made a good impression on this first encounter with Dr. Krukowski. And in the first encounter with Behrens, Behrens puts down the guest's eyelid and diagnoses anemia, and advises the guest to undergo the customary local rituals, such as this resting cure or lying cure. And shortly afterwards, the guest will have his first encounter with Mrs. Mühlendonk, and then the guest has an encounter with Eastern European woman who fascinates him with her attractive female body. And a specific detail, the tightly compressed breasts are mentioned in particular. Right? And also here is in both cases something like, no, here, um, a, a the timing is changing. Here, something like a fast-forward effect begins to come into play in this second version of the scene now, when James Tinappel is the visitor, because Hans Castorp only noticed such anatomical details of the Eastern European woman a little later, but James Tinappel recognizes this very early on. And also, the dinner conversation about death and decay comes much earlier for James Tinappel than for Hans, who only had this conversation with Behrens a couple of weeks or even months after his arrival during this visit to the private apartments of Behrens. And this faster pace, the assault with the impressions of eroticism and death, this is also probably responsible for the fact that James Tinappel's stay ends differently to that of Hans Castorp's. Tinappel departs rather hastily. It seems to be a kind of self-protection mechanism. A quote from the text was Hans is thinking, oh, somebody had taken to his heels. In headlong haste, breathless, as though the moment of resolution must not be let slip, he had flung his things together and made off. So what does this visit mean? For Hans, it was one more break with the past and bourgeois life, a cut that he perceived as the next stage of liberation. Thus ended the campaign by the Flatland to recover its lost Hans Castrop. For the Flatland, it meant just a metaphorical shrug of the shoulders. For Hans, it meant the consummation of freedom. Okay, number two, what does this mirror scene mean? So I think this almost identical repetition of the arrival scene, it gives me the impression that the Berghof is something like a relentless mechanical thing, a relentless mechanism, a sort of clockwork that runs according to fixed rules and laws and always tries the same thing to cast a spell over newcomers with the same tricks. It made me think of old horror films about haunted houses in which the viewer sees several victims, one after another, fall into the same trap, and that's always working the same mode. And you, as a viewer, as a spectator, you know what's coming. You want to scream and to warn the victims, but the mechanism works relentlessly. And yeah, no, Thomas Mann would probably have refused to be associated with the horror film genre, but I believe that the narrative devices he uses here are actually very similar. Now, it is certainly not the creepy effect for the reader that he's aiming at, but the relentlessness of this mechanism, the almost mechanical laws, the seductiveness of this parallel world, inescapable. So perhaps this also makes us a little bit more lenient with Hans. It is not only his inertia and his flight from the world that makes him become entangled in the clutches of the Berghof. But this Berghof, it is a system in which everything is designed to cast a spell on new arrivals, on the guests, to pathologize them, to seduce them, and to turn them into permanent paying guests who are lost to the flatland. And this also gives the story of Hans Castrop a more general dimension, I think. It's no longer such an individual story, but as the author has pointed out in the forward, Hans is simply an example, one of many who felt the same way or are in danger of feeling the same way. And here we can probably really go back to the first chapter and to the first video. So what is this novel about, and why can it still be read with interest and valuable insight today? Yeah, precisely because it is not just the individual story of a bizarre individual, but because it is a general story of humanity. And so it's a story of a disoriented person in a period of upheaval in society, a person that can be seduced or captured by systems that provide an intoxicating mixture of escapism, a sense of purpose, fixed routines, and values, but which also harbor their dangers beneath the seductive surface because they pursue also self-serving goals, because they make one unfit for active life and they lead to alienation from society and from normal active life. Third point, there is more to discover here too, but I will limit myself to a few hints. So despite the impressive mirror image that we have in this scene of the arrival of James Teenapple compared to the arrival of Hans, there are significant differences. Hans' attitude when James arrived was very different from Joachim's attitude when Hans arrived. Joachim was already showing signs of impatience and dissatisfaction. He criticized openly the life on the Berghof at many points, and he was interested in life in Hamburg. He was interested in what's going on down there in the lowlands. And Hans, on the other hand, seems to be very happy in his role as a fully integrated inhabitant of the Berghof, as an expert and a tourist guide for the visitors. He only talks about life on the Berghof. He is not at all interested in what is happening in Hamburg and in the bourgeois society and in his family and for his relatives. And ultimately, James' reaction is completely different from Hans. James sees the danger and flees, but Hans runs into her arms with flying colors. So that is this is certainly an aspect that somewhat limits or modifies what I said earlier about the Birkhoff as a relentlessly running seductive mechanism. Yes, it is true that the Birkhoff always runs its same program, always trying to play the same tricks on newcomers, but it is not fatalism. This is not an completely inevitable fate. Humans still have the liberty to react differently to it. So you can escape the Birkhoff if you want to and if you take the plunge early enough. Okay, so that's it for today's video. I hope you have enjoyed the video, and I hope I've been able to give you some nice and interesting indications for further rereading of this section. So the next video will come out in a week or two, who knows? I'm reluctant now to offer exact dates because when I do, usually something happens and I have to postpone the video. But nevertheless, this project will continue until the end. We will move up and down the Magic Mountain. So until we see us next time, I wish you a great reading time. Take care. Bye bye and ciao.